I'm R.T. Rybak from the Minneapolis Foundation. I'm here with my colleague, Patrice Relerford, who leads our education work. And we're really very proud to have with us today Dr. Michael Rodriguez from the University of Minnesota. Dr. Rodriguez has been our partner on a more than a year-long project called Reimagine Minnesota, which is work that began with community input into how we disrupt education inequities. It was then built on by a coalition of every superintendent in the Minneapolis-St. Paul metropolitan area. We built on top of that a convening with student voice. We built on top of that an incredible research report led by Dr. Rodriguez and researchers from the university, all aligned, looking at how we disrupt the inequities in education. Well, now education has changed almost overnight. We're dealing with distance learning. So we went back to Dr. Rodriguez and his research team and really asked, what should we be thinking right now as parents, as educators, as policymakers, as any community leader or member? Really, what should we be thinking about right now when we recognize that education is turned on its head and we want to turn on its head the racial inequities that have left too many kids behind? Dr. Rodriguez, welcome. We're really happy to have you here today. One of the things I like to do to start with is to just think about what is probably a pretty complicated relationship right now. There's a parent and their kid in the next room with an iPad or hopefully a computer trying to figure out their school lessons. What should they be thinking right now, especially if one of the things we hope they're thinking about is how do we close these horribly inequitable gaps in education right now?
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate the opportunity to talk with you a bit about this and the opportunity to extend this work and continue the partnership with the Minneapolis Foundation and with others. Parents have a big role. Parents have always had a big role. And it's particularly these days when we're all staying at home and sheltering in place. The first thing we have to remember is that parents need to be parents. And that's really their primary role. Parents still need to be parents. And students really need to depend on the consistency of that parenting. And they need that parent relationship to be in place. A lot of students find a lot of consistency by going to school, and the consistency of the relationships with their teachers and their peers, their mentors, their coaches, their counselors. All of these relationships bring great consistency and a sense of safety and support to students. And the hard part about the staying at home and the remote instruction is that a lot of those relationships have been disrupted, the relationships that students have in their classroom. And this is really important and not something that we should overlook, because learning is a social activity. And that social context of the classroom and school and those relationships that make learning function have been disrupted. So we have to reestablish and newly create opportunities for these kinds of relationships. So we have to rely on the relationships that parents have with their students. Be parents. The second thing parents can do then is to seek networks of supports, to reestablish and build supports that students will need to be in place, utilizing other family members, older children and adolescents, older brothers and sisters and siblings, nieces and nephews and cousins. It's really important because this provides an opportunity for students to learn from other members of the family. When possible, when we can connect with our elders or older generations in the family through phone calls or video calls, students can explore those kinds of connections as well. And then parents can also help connect with teachers and school leaders. Hopefully I think schools are doing a great job of reaching out and being accessible to parents and families. That has to work on both ends. Parents also have to be connecting with teachers and with school leaders, particularly to find out what other kinds of resources and supports are available, and making sure that their children are connecting and reestablishing those relationships.
It's such a fascinating picture you paint, because it's really one that's very different than peer learning. A room full of kids at the same age and vaguely level the other kids. Now you're almost painting the picture of the one-room schoolhouse.
Yeah, so here, yeah, I really
Go ahead.
appreciate that one-room schoolhouse, because here's an interesting dynamic now that is happening and that we now have to rely on. And it's a dynamic we've always relied on in the history of humanity. There is no learning theory that suggests the optimal way of learning is to put students and children in age-specific groups. People have always learned from each other. Younger children learn from older children, and all children learn from their elders, and communities create learning opportunities. Now we have to really rely on that. We have to rely on older siblings and older members of the family and the communities in order to create that learning environment.
So put that within the context of education and equities. And one of the big issues that you certainly and many others have talked about, certainly you did in the Reimagine report, is the dynamic of kids of color having almost exclusively white teachers throughout their entire career. Now those kids of color are probably in a learning community with parents and siblings of color.
Yeah.
How much of that experience should families lean into to really give kids that cultural context they haven't been getting in the traditional classroom?
This is another great dynamic that we can really all learn from. Students now have the opportunity to really learn about what their families and communities value in different subject areas. When a student goes to school, they encounter a teacher. The teacher is the subject matter expert. Teachers have studied and learned to appreciate and value their disciplinary knowledge and their disciplinary ways of doing. Scientific knowledge and scientific ways of doing. Mathematical knowledge, right? Mathematical ways of doing. Families and communities have deep traditions around traditional knowledge and what's valued and ways of doing, ways of knowing. This is an opportunity for us to really understand how bridging those can really be powerful. We can explore within families and communities mathematical ways of knowing and doing and scientific ways of knowing and doing. And there have been schools that have been really successful at this, connecting with families and with elders and communities in order to bridge disciplinary values in knowledge and practice with community values of knowledge and practice. We've seen this in schools such as Anishinaabe, where teachers created themes, and one of those themes is ricing. Well, think about the history and tradition of ricing, particularly in Minnesota. We have a long and deep tradition around wild rice. Let's explore the science in ricing and the history in ricing and the mathematics in cultivation and production of wild rice. We can do that in very simple ways within the household. There's lots of science that occurs in households that families and parents and adults particularly sort of take for granted, right? There's lots of science and math in cooking and meal preparation, in home safety. And now we're all being sort of super conscious about home safety. What are the practices that we engage in to keep our families and our neighbors safe? There's a lot of science behind that. And let's explore the science in what we do and what we know. And so that not only gives students a reason for studying and a reason for learning, but it gives them an internal, intrinsic motivation, because this is what's going to help me be the kind of person that I want to be in my family and my community, and support the values that we already have in place.
What we're dealing with now is this pandemic that is global, the scope of which us adults are having extraordinary trouble navigating. How do you go to that relevance and that cultural relevance at a moment where, I guess the big question is, how much of this in real stark terms do we bring into our kids as part of their learning experience? And where is the point that a parent tries to shield, especially with a kid who may have a lot of trauma in their day-to-day life, even before this started?
Yeah, the questions around home life and community life and trauma are really pronounced right now, because many of us acknowledge the trauma in our own families and our own communities. This is traumatic for a lot of people. It's not only traumatic for children and students and their parents, but also for teachers and educators, because we're all experiencing this across the globe. There is an opportunity in this because of the intense attention to what's happening and the effort to problem solve. And there's so many venues that are engaged in problem solving right now. We acknowledge that the network of problem solving is what's really going to bring us forward. But it also requires transparency and communication. And we're seeing struggles across the globe in terms of who's being transparent and how are we distinguishing between fact and fiction. And what do we know in terms of the practices and the information that we have that is real versus noise. This is real critical thinking and real problem solving and an evaluation of what should we be attending to, because there's so much right now. What should we be attending to that is really going to be helpful and move us forward? And there's actually a lot of scholarship around this, around helping young people and adults distinguish between fact and fiction, and then what should we hold on to in order to move forward. Particularly in students or in communities of color, where we see that existing disparities in health access and healthcare, for example, are leading to disparities in outcomes because of the pandemic. That's real, and that's hurting some communities at a much higher level than it is hurting others.
Let's talk about the structure of learning within the home environment right now. I was talking to a colleague the other day, and she has 3 kids who are learning in the house right now as she's trying to do her work. One of them is a rule follower, and she's sitting down at 10:15 to do math, and she's supposed to sit at 10:15 to do math. And another kid is doing little work, going outside and playing, coming in and doing a little work, and a third is just not on task at all. Now, in a classroom setting, one of those kids is following the rules, quote unquote, and the other 2 are absent or getting in a whole lot of trouble. It's a little different, as I was reading in your report, about whether the expectation of attendance and absenteeism is the same, and especially time. If you're a parent and you have 2 kids, and one of them is sitting down at quote unquote the proper time, and the other one is getting the work done, but not on the school schedule you would normally do, should you care right now?
Right, that's a great question. One thing that we're emphasizing at the University of Minnesota is the power in providing flexibility. But we don't want flexibility to be a ticket to ignoring responsibility. We want people to be responsible, and we need our children to be responsible. We need to help teach our children how to be responsible in times of really great distress. And this is absolutely one of those times. And this is an opportunity for us as adults to model that behavior of being responsible, of building a schedule of daily routine and sticking to that schedule. This is absolutely not a time where we have to think we need business as usual, because this is not business as usual. And we can't act as though it's business as usual, because it's simply not. But we can build routines and a schedule in order to be productive and responsible. So having that schedule is important, but providing opportunities for flexibility is also important. So instead of saying no right now, no, you cannot do this right now, you can say, okay, well, let's take this time to have a break, and then let's use the other time to make sure that we get done what we need to get done. So we can say, yes, you can take this time off right now, but let's find another time where we're going to get our work done. The other piece I think it's really important is in order to really connect schoolwork with home and community life, because right now, and for so many children, those things have been so separated. We do schoolwork at school. We do home and community life at home. We can't separate those things right now because children are at home and in the community. But we can ask our children and ask our students to find examples at home and in the community of the things we're doing at school to build that connection. We can connect family knowledge and expertise with the disciplinary practices that we're trying to instill in our students. And so when we ask students to find opportunities, and parents can do this, parents can say, you know, this science problem or this math problem or this history problem, let's explore that at home. And let's apply it to a setting at home where we can find that same situation. How does this relate to where we're at in place right now?
Are there any resources you can point parents to that are easy to access to help do some of what you've just mentioned?
In the report, this Implementing Practices of Reimagine Minnesota in a Period of Remote Teaching and Learning, there are a number of links. And some of those links provide really useful guides and activities, some practices. Some of them are videos and little blogs. I would really encourage teachers and school leaders and educators to explore some of those because people are really putting a lot online right now that hasn't really been available so easily. And a lot of that is really functional, practical, in-place activities and advice. People are really getting down to the basics and recognizing that we need to sort of cut through all the chase and really get to it. You know, I think I think the other thing that I'm seeing is across schools. So one thing is across families, and we see this, families are relying on each other and the extended families in a new way. I see some of my cousins online helping support other cousins who are doing homework. So the cousins are getting online, they do their homework, and then they do some gaming, as cousins do online. And so having to rely on each other is this really interesting opportunity. But the other thing I see is across schools and school districts. School districts are really coming together to problem solve in a really important way. And we've always been so territorial with respect to what we do within school districts. In part, we're territorial because of the competitive environments that federal school accountability systems have produced. And we're a bit territorial because of the competition over students that school funding mechanisms has encouraged. We've lost out so much by not working together across district lines. But districts are doing that. They're creating networks of improvement and networks of collaboration that I think are really important, and that needs to be encouraged. One of the agents that has really bridged district lines is the Minnesota Assessment Group. The Minnesota Assessment Group has been meeting regularly online to share things they've created to support families and students at home. School districts through the Minnesota Assessment Group are communicating about how they've solved problems. They've created task groups, and they're doing problem solving and troubleshooting. And they're sharing a lot of information, and school districts are going to be so much better off. I hope that these networks and the sharing and collaboration can be captured and retained in the future, because I think that's been really important.
But when you go back to the earlier part of this conversation and think about what seem to be some ironic glimmers of hope that are actually showing up in thinking differently about education in this distance period of time, think about some of those suggestions you made, about not necessarily grouping kids by age, about building more experiences of people of color into the curriculum and more relevancy. So a kid of color is much more connected to their own experience. How do we really intentionally not go back to normal? How do we not replicate, but reinvent?
Well, that reminds me of Superintendent Munoz from Rochester Public Schools. I've heard him speak a couple of times, and a couple of times he has said for us to really turn things around and really address core equity issues to make educational opportunity and experiences a bit more equitable really requires system redesign, and so much of our efforts are tweaking around the margins. It really requires sort of a systemic redesign and rethinking. I don't know if we'll get there. I don't know if we have the willpower or the political clout or whatever it is that it will take to really do a deep redesign. And in part, it's because the equity outcome challenge that we see in education is in part created by and sustained by many other policy arenas. We know that housing, accessible, fair, and affordable, and safe housing, and access to healthcare and employment opportunities and transportation routines, and all of these other policy arenas impact educational outcomes. And they can be supportive of educational outcomes, but we need to bring all these policy arenas together. The reports that we've written acknowledge the role of many other community partners and players, policymakers, school leaders, but folks in these other policy arenas. They all have a role to play in educational outcomes.
In the original Reimagine report that you at the university did for the Minneapolis Foundation, you brought out a really significant point about implementation science. And as someone who's not a professional in this, it was a really great insight to me, because so often we have these conversations about some good idea or great learning strategy in this classroom, and we ask that question, why can't everyone do it? And getting these things to scale is one of the huge issues we have. But the insight I got from the report that you wrote was that this isn't an art, there's a science to implementation, and that you at the university have been doing a lot about that. When you think about some of these things that we're going to be learning from this distance learning experiment, how do some of the principles of implementation science get applied to bringing a good idea that we found in this period of time to scale?
Yeah, I think there's a lot for us to learn from implementation science. Two big messages that I try to continually reinforce are that this kind of work, especially around education equity work has to be actively maintained. So it's really important, and this is one vehicle. We have a report, and we have evidence, and we have support, and that report now needs to move us forward. That has to be actively managed. And one important tool for actively managing educational equity plans and goals is to have a team that is dedicated to that, so that it's not on a single person, and that it's a shared effort. And that team has to represent at least a couple of the really key stakeholders. And so another thing that I've been trying to think about and encourage schools and communities to really take to heart is to bridge these two principles of implementation science and student voice. Student voice is often viewed as simply listening to students, but that is not enough. Listening to students is just not sufficient. Schools that are serious about student voice acknowledge students as thought leaders and innovators. They see students as partners in decision-making, and they employ students as implementation agents. So these schools engage students in helping to solve persistent challenges, because students have all kinds of brainiac ideas, but also have students participate in the decision-making, and then have students implement initiatives in new ways of doing things. And when students are engaged in implementation, oftentimes we see more progress, because students typically have more invested in that implementation and the outcome. So here's a real way of securing some of the principles of implementation science and eliminating some of the barriers to implementation by enlisting the actual community where we're doing the implementing in the implementation process itself.
I understand one example of that is in Minneapolis schools, Eric Moore, who leads research and evaluation there, as well as academics, has enlisted families to be part of the data collection, which is a very different experience than having someone swoop in from another community and say, hey, we want to study you.
Right. And there's a growing field around that approach called, well, it could be youth participatory action research. It could be community action research, teacher action research. When participants of the community where we're doing research actually participates in the research. This is the same kind of principle of parents being directly engaged in learning activities. Parents as educators, where parents can bring their sort of parental, traditional community-based knowledge and ways of knowing and doing, and bridge disciplinary knowledge and ways of knowing and doing. We can do this not only in teaching, but we can do it in research, and we can do it in intervention discovery, intervention planning, and intervention implementation. We really appreciate the invitation to contribute. We've been working together now for over a year with the Minneapolis Foundation and with the foundation partners. And the College of Education and Human Development is an organization of engaged scholars. Many of us, faculty, staff, and students, are working in schools and communities to improve outcomes. And we do it because we are driven in part to learn and to understand and to grow, but also to return that learning and understanding to communities. And this effort with Reimagine Minnesota that you have invited us into really deepens our respect for the work of school and community leaders. And it really helps us think about the more practical side of our work. And it's really helped us be more engaged scholars and be more practice oriented. Real problems are immediate and need immediate attention. We also just acknowledge that human connections drive success in education. And all of the efforts to solve and reduce educational inequities have been grounded in this principle that human connections really drive success in education. It's really important for us to focus on what's important right now. And what's important right now are relationships, and particularly with parents and family, because that's where we're located. But at the same time, we have to remember that there are greater outcomes yet to be achieved. And we need to focus on all the responsibilities that we have, each of us. And so we want to instill that in our youth and our students and acknowledge that we're creating flexible environments and expectations, but we want students to maintain effort, to grow, to learn, to be productive, and to prepare for what's to come. Because there's a lot of great things that are yet to come. And every one of our students needs to be prepared so they have opportunities and access to all those great things that are yet to come.
Well, Dr. Rodriguez, thanks. It's such a terrific honor to work with you and your colleagues at the University of Minnesota. And I think we really want at the Minneapolis Foundation to just reinforce that We see you as not only an incredible resource, but as a really critical piece of the infrastructure. So we're going to continue to reach out to you at the university and bring those great ideas directly into our communities to have more impact. So the new report you've given about how to address equities in this period of distance learning is going to be something we're going to get out as far and wide as we can, and hope we can continue to work with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And for everyone out there, the report's on our website, minneapolisfoundation.org. Thank you.
Take care.